crimes under the jurisdiction of the ICC. Just like that. These are also crimes that we're now interested in. And there's a bit, I think there's something a bit that we need to be, that makes us, should make us feel uncomfortable with that somehow. More crimes then. More crimes, and of course, genocide and crimes against humanity can also be war crimes. So it's sometimes quite difficult just to distinguish between them. Okay, so war crimes go back, well, this is 1948. Crimes against humanity, arguably at the Nuremberg Tribunal, first time it came up. War crimes then go back further in history with the Geneva Conventions, and, well, the Geneva Convention came after that anyway, but war crimes have already been part of the law of armed conflict and sort of recognised crimes. What are war crimes then? We've got genocide, which is the intent to eliminate an ethnic group. Crimes against humanity, which can also be ethnic cleansing, murder, rape, and so on. What are war crimes?
Breaches of international humanitarian law.
Yeah. Breaches of international humanitarian laws, such as...
like not giving someone the right prisoner of war status.
Yeah, absolutely. So prisoners of war are protected under the Geneva Conventions, and if you don't protect them, then that can be a war crime. Okay, then the crime of aggression. So, why is the crime of aggression so problematic?
Sinds de UN is een beetje maatregels gevallen. Ze gaan dus ook eens aggression, international waging war, and wars now leaving.
Yeah, so the nexus between, so this has always been an uncomfortable nexus between the ICC and the UN, and something that people have been very concerned about. So in the early days of the ICC, this was really sort of one of the biggest concerns. Is the ICC the court of the UN? Is it the UN which can then, and in those days already it was becoming clear that the Security Council had sort of these political motives and so on. How much power does the UN have in the ICC was always sort of the question. And the ICC always sort of emphasised its independence of the UN, and still does as well. Now, the crime of aggression, though, is intimately entwined with the UN Charter because it is understood as mostly as an act which inhibits the territorial integrity of a state. So it's sort of the military intervention type of crimes. At Rome, they couldn't agree what the relationship between the UN and the ICC should be. And so they then said, we'll decide that at a conference in 10 years' time. We'll meet again, and perhaps then we will be able to come up with a definition of the crime of aggression, and we'll be able to come up with a way in which the UN, what role the UN plays. So at the Kampala conference in 2010, they decided that the crime of aggression was basically an infringement of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which we had suspected all along anyway. So nothing new there. It's still not possible to bring a case for the crime of aggression, because at the Kampala conference, they then said, in about a decade, more specifically actually from January 2017, so from January this year, we'll reconsider. We still haven't heard anything. So the crime of aggression, they're really putting it off. Why? Why do you think this is such a difficult one?
Isn't it almost impossible to prove a crime of aggression anyway, even just involve Article 51?
Yeah. Proof Yes. But you could see perhaps, you mean in terms of sequence, you can just say, anyone would always say they were acting in self-defense. Yeah.
I mean, and that's what states do, right? They basically claim
Never claim that they're the aggressor.
Like the Polish thing with the Germans who were Nazis, they attacked themselves with Polish uniforms. So it's like, well, it's not an act of aggression, it's an act of self-defence. That's why we're taking over the rest of Europe.
Well, and more recently, of course, the Bush Doctrine, have you done that in Levant conflict? The preemptive attack, where the US was the first to, was the aggressor, but claimed it was still under Article 51 of the UN Charter, so it was still acting in self-defence, because what was the point of waiting for weapons of mass destruction to hit you? So in a way, yes, it will be difficult to prove, but also this is so clearly a question of so war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. There's no question of who started the fighting. This is the use in bello, isn't it? And then this would be the use ad bellum. So, who is that fault that the fighting started in the first place? And that's always politically much more difficult. Okay, so we've got those 4 crimes. Any questions on the 4 crimes in the Rome Statute? Okay, so let's think then about which crimes could be part of this but are not. So we've already got drug trafficking, money laundering. Which other crimes?
Both people trafficking and arms trafficking as well.
Yeah, people and arms trafficking. So people trafficking is sort of modern day slavery, arms trafficking as something which quite clearly has a huge impact on warfare and could minimise and prohibit warfare if it were prevented. Yet it's not an international crime. Other crimes?
Just the contentious ones, terrorism and piracy.
Yes, so terrorism is generally regarded as being a crime against humanity. It's generally regarded as falling under that. There has been a big push to have a separate crime of terrorism, and in fact, other tribunals do criminalise terrorism. So the Lebanon Tribunal, for example, recognises terrorism as a crime. It's been very difficult to come up with a definition that everyone's happy with, again, so which is another reason why it's been kept off of that list. And all those which are kind of contentious, but the ICC still wants to have, they fall under crimes against humanity. And then you said piracy.
Yeah.
Yes, also crime against humanity. Recognised, not actually that, it's not actually that disputed.
But sorry, were there not specific reasons that were given at the conceptual studies of the ICC as to why terrorism and piracy were not included in the Rome Statutes?
Were there reasons? Yes, well, for terrorism it was because of the lack of a definition and because they couldn't politically come up with a definition.
So now, does the ICC have jurisdiction over terrorist activities and other crimes against humanity?
Yes, it will claim that it does.
Even though it's not in the statute?
Yeah. The same as that's what I said. The prosecutor decided that land grabbing should be part of this. And environmental crimes. It's not in the statute.
So they can just come up with policies to say this is.
Well, this is what they're doing. This is why this is what I think is very problematic, because the prosecutor suddenly says, we'll move away from physical violence once, and we'll move into another area, possibly a little bit into this area. I mean, land grabbing, potentially, corporations commit those crimes. Aidan.
Can we put cybercrime?
Cybercrime, yes. Well, isn't it? Any other ones? Okay.
Instigation.
Instigation. As an international crime. In which way?
Well, it's attached to the crime, so because it's incoherent, it's still a crime, but it's not. So if you're facilitating a crime, say for example money laundering, you're the HSBC,
Yeah.
you're supplying services to the crime.
Yes. Instigation as a separate crime or as a...
Or just fitting in there somewhere.
The modes of liability will come to it in a moment, and perhaps that falls under something like you're interested in. Yeah, well, I mean, financial crimes, right? So what happened in the shortly before the financial crisis, arguably the bankers there who were taking advantage of the derivative market for essentially as a way of gambling for their own gain, possible crimes.
So it'd be offshore then. So that'd be transaction because it's offshore.
Yeah.
What do you call it? Sorry, I'm thinking tax havens, that's what I meant to say.
Yes, tax evasion. Google, Starbucks, Apple. So what's the kind of pattern? What do you think is what's the pattern that's emerging? What patterns do you see?
It's high end.
High end. What do you mean with high end? Yeah. What do we call those kind of crimes usually?
Crimes of grave concern.
Sorry?
Crimes of grave concern.
Of grave concern. Oh, I was thinking of the white collar crimes, right? Yeah. So they all have something to do with the economy. Yeah? Why is it that economic crimes are not international crimes? Why did they fall off
It's a form of
the
fascism.
list? Sorry?
It's a form of fascism. We talk about fascism being the state being controlled by economic interests. Well, the economic interests of the state almost decomplete.
And who has particular economic interests?
Multinationals.
Multinationals, yes.
Certain class of people.
Certain class of people. Certain class of people, certain class of states, the hegemonic states, the particularly powerful states who got there in the first place because they are able to take advantage of the world as it is, if you will. So economic crimes, the question, so what we've said before about these crimes is that in terms of, now I'll get back to the ideological aspect, what's difficult to get to with these crimes are the root causes. How did it come to this in the first place? Yeah? And because it's difficult to get to this, that's why there has been a general focus on the Global South as the place of victims and perpetrators. The Global North is seen as having passed through that phase with Nuremberg and Tokyo, and they've moved on, and now they're the ones dispensing justice. They're the ones who get to call the shots in how a society is to be led. And part of the reason is that these crimes don't show the complicity of Western states. While if you were to have these crimes in an international court, the complicity of Western states would be very much at the surface. That's my thesis for you. What do you think?
Did you say that environmental crimes can be considered crimes against humanity?
Yeah.
Couldn't they also be considered economic crimes as well?
Yes, that's why I was saying sort of land grabbing, environmental crimes, usually committed by corporations. However, the problem is, of course, and this, in fact, the policy of the Office of the Prosecutor was welcomed with huge bravado by NGOs who said, finally, the prosecution can get to root causes. Finally, they can look at multinational corporations and their complicity. Finally, we can look at questions of how corporations are causing indirectly a lot of suffering, if not directly, through land grabbing and so on. But the problem is, of course, that corporations can't be made responsible under international criminal law. So who is then made responsible?
Corporate executives.
Corporate executives. Do you think that will be the case?
Yeah, well, in your post you said there's been precedent for that.
For precedent for corporate executives, yes, not under international criminal law.
Countries who have the treaty together.
Who have the
Treaty.
those who have signed the contract. So this is what I was saying in my post, is that it's likely that any kind of criminal liability would go to those government officials who sign the contracts with the corporations who then go on to commit the crimes. So it would just be a sustaining of the current order, because those who are made liable are again those in the global south who have been exploited.
Would there also be a huge issue between the contractors and the subcontractors, and where does the liability end?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is often why it's so difficult to get criminal liability of corporations and of CEOs and so on, not only because there are so many ways in which they're protected, but also because of the contract, the subcontracts, the subcontracts and so on. And when it actually gets down to the nitty-gritty, those who are most exposed are those on the ground, not those in their offices in London and New York. So I think it would be very difficult to get criminal liability of any CEOs through environmental crimes or land grabbing. I think actually the reverse would happen, that it would be, again, a branding of the global south as those committing international crimes, while those who are complicit in creating these conditions in the first place would go off free. So anyway, so far we can see one of the patterns that's emerging is that economic crimes are generally not considered as international crimes. And those were the ones which dropped off the list when it came to the negotiations in Rome. So I think actually now would be a good time for the Tadic. Shall I get the... covered in a huge form here. Do you want to go to the camera?
Do you want me to speak about Kyoto as well?
Kyoto. Oh, do you wanted to? Oh, right. I thought
did
about
have
it
this
before.
one. Oh, you have you? But I can just do. I prefer just do have it if you want me to.
Yeah. We can. Oh yeah, Kyoto should work well as well.
I can just speak about it. I was going to send you the presentation anyway, for information. I have some things.
Okay.
They're a bit confusing.
I think to do research as well.
On the positive and vital.
Yeah.
Thinking about and
Yeah. They were two separate.
oh, well then, okay. Definitely give some else in this one, wasn't it?
Was sort of a mid-ranking general, and now his name has become associated with one of the biggest cases of international criminal law. So it's the first case at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, as Hannah said, and the first thing that came up was, okay, so we have set this thing up now, we've put all this money into this, appointed all these judges, and got this defence team ready and so on. Do we have jurisdiction? So the defence said, why are we here in the first place? The problem is, this court was set up by an executive organ. An executive organ cannot simply set up a judicial organ. What do we call that? If an executive organ sets up a judicial organ. Sorry? Oh, yes, yeah, but what do we call it? It happens when the executive sets up a tribunal. What is it then? It's a military tribunal, isn't it? If the executive sets up a tribunal, then it is a military tribunal. And so the defence team quite rightly said, isn't this a bit strange? An executive organ setting up a seeming, what it calls an independent judicial organ. So that was the first thing that the defence team said. And the judges sitting there just moved to The Hague in their new gowns, said, why, of course we have jurisdiction. That's strange. So the court, in a very nifty turn of events, declared itself to have jurisdiction of this case. It's no joke. And in fact, since then, except for the ICC, every single tribunal has done exactly the same thing. Because the defence team has every single time said, how was this set up? Why are we here? And why do these people suddenly have jurisdiction over this case? Of course, what's the problem with such tribunals is that they criminalise actions, as Hannah said, that have happened in the past, prior to the tribunal being set up and prior to the tribunal statute being set up. Now in criminal law, that is generally not allowed. You can't criminalise someone for something that they couldn't have known was a crime. Now, of course, what the tribunals regularly say, this was customary international law anyway, these are crimes which are binding on everyone should know that you can't do this. But it's still a legitimate concern to have that someone, particularly in a war, is following orders. It's another common defence, of course, and didn't even know that this court might exist at some point. So the Tadic case is famous for that, for deciding it has jurisdiction. And it's also famous for defining what effective control is, and also for what's called joint criminal enterprise at the in international criminal law. So these are the principles of liability, the modes of liability under international criminal law. So the thing, of course, with international criminal law is that you usually have someone in the dock who has not necessarily, with their own hands, committed a crime. They've usually been the ones organising things in the background. So what international criminal law wants to do is to get to them. Rightly so, yeah? So previously, there would have been no way of actually making them responsible, which is then where these different modes of liability come up. Joint criminal enterprise is not regarded as a mode of liability under the International Criminal Court, but it is at the ICTY. And it's referred to as JCE, and within all defence circles in The Hague, it's referred to as just convict everyone, JCE, because it's so broad, the understanding of joint criminal enterprise is so broad that basically everyone falls under it. So, in Tadic, it was said that this requires three elements: a plurality of persons, broad, the existence of a common plan, design or purpose which amounts to or involves the commission of a crime provided for in the statute, so a common plan, extremely broad, and then participation of the accused in a common design involving the perpetration of one of the crimes provided for the statute. So it could just be participation in the design of this common plan. So that is an extremely broad base of potential perpetrators you have there for joint criminal enterprise. So the International Criminal Court, knowing of these problems with JCE, has therefore decided to go with co-perpetration, which is a bit narrower, where it requires the intent of that person to commit that crime, and not just some kind of common design, common plan. And then, of course, when it comes to getting the person who is at the top, that's referred to as command responsibility. So the person who is setting out the plan and who is giving orders will have this command responsibility. So those are the what's referred to as the modes of liability, the different ways in which you can become liable criminally at an international criminal court or tribunal. Any questions to that? I mean, it's all in the textbook in the crier anyway, but just as a sort of short synopsis of that. Now, what I wanted to do with you quickly is a quiz. So, how many teams shall we have? We'll have 4 teams. So, 1, 2, 3, 4. Do you want to maybe go with that? Yeah? 2, and then the back row, 1, 2, 3, 4. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, there's a hand. Okay, then the 3 of you and the 3 of you. Yeah, Ruth, Carol, and Brian, and then Ruth. Oh no, I already sent you that. Okay, so you stay there, and then so you can join.